Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Corker, Senator Flake, Senator McConnell and Schumer and the leaders for their discussions. The Vice President, I thank him for his presence here today. In my own view, government shutdowns ought not to be a part of budget negotiations any more than chemical weapons should be a part of warfare. And we were elected to make the government run for taxpayers, not to shut it down. So my hope is that this will put us on a path toward a result and recognize the President's desire for increased border security, which we support, which many Democrats support as well, and we can finish our appropriations process. What I'd like to do now is say a few words about what was described in a very famous movie in which Jimmy Stewart played, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, as democracy's finest show, the right to talk your head off, the legislative filibuster. Unless someone say, well, Senator Alexander, you just announced you're not going to run for re-election in 2 years, so you're going to change your tune. I'm not changing my tune. I'd ask consent to include in the record remarks that I made in 2011 at the Heritage Foundation about the tradition of the legislative filibuster, perhaps the best known part of the United States Senate. And I'd like to tell a story, Mr. Vice President. In 1978, a young Utah senator came here. He was conservative. He didn't know what he could not do. And so he took on the Democratic establishment on their most important issue. Orrin Hatch was the senator. He's our longest serving Republican senator. He's retiring this year. And what he decided to do was to challenge the Democratic leadership who wanted to pass organized labor's major objective of the time. Something would have changed the relationship between employers and employees for years to come. Now, at that time, 1978, there was a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter. There were 62 Republican senators, more than enough to pass a bill. There were 292 House members. So if Orrin Hatch hadn't been new and young, and if he'd known more about what he was doing, he probably wouldn't have even tried this. But he did try it. Mr. President and Madam President, he won. He offered 1,200 amendments. Senator Byrd, the distinguished majority leader of the Senate, tried 6 times to cut off debate. We call that cloture here in the Senate. And he didn't get 60 votes. 6 different times he tried to cut that off. And so the end result was that the minority view, the Republican view at that time, prevailed against a Democratic president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. That happened before. It happened in the 1960s. Everett Dirksen was the Republican leader of the United States Senate, sitting right over there. He had even fewer Republican senators. When Orrin Hatch did his work in the 1978, there were 38 Republican senators. Dirksen had fewer than that. And Lyndon Johnson and George Meany and the American labor movement decided that they wanted, in effect, to make it illegal for any state to have a right to work law. That's what they wanted to do, and they thought they could do it, except the legislative filibuster was in place. At that time, it took 67 votes, and Everett Dirksen toured the country, and he was able to defeat a measure supported by overwhelming Democratic majorities. Now, why do I tell those stories, Mr. President? It's because the shoe's on the other foot right now. The Republicans are in charge, and we hear many people, including the President, say, get rid of the filibuster, get rid of the legislative majority, let's do it our way. Madam President, we should not do that. We have never done that in the United States Senate. The Senate has always been different. One senator said to me a few minutes ago, that's the whole reason I came to the Senate from the House. So every time the majority got an idea, it wouldn't be like a freight train running through the Senate. One of the major purposes of the legislative filibuster is to protect the minority in this country. A young Frenchman wandered through America in the 1830s. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote a book Democracy in America that maybe is the best book on democracy in America ever written. It was very perceptive. He said he saw, looking ahead, two potential problems for the American democracy. One, he said, was Russia. That was prescient. The other, he said, was the tyranny of the majority. Alexis de Tocqueville said in the 1830s that one of the great problems for our country might be the tyranny of the majority. And it is the United States Senate that is a bulwark to prevent the tyranny of the majority in the American democracy. It has been from the beginning, and it is today. Now, some of our Republican friends and conservative friends, and sometimes our presidents say, well, let's get rid of it. We might think about the fact that we Republicans, we conservatives, are usually the one in the minority. We're usually the one needing protection. Since World War II, nearly 70 years, Democrats have had complete control of the United States government. They've had the Senate, they've had the House, they've had the presidency for 22 years. Republicans have had it for 8 years. Democrats have had control 22 years, and we 8 years. So democracy's finest hour, the right to talk your head off, the opportunity for extended debate, has benefited our side, Democrats could say, more than their side. So why should we be the ones who are trying to change it? In fact, we weren't. In 1995, after the big Republican sweep, you know, we have these. One of us is in charge, and then the people get tired of us, and they put the other one in charge. So in 1995, big Republican sweep, Republicans in charge of the Senate, and a Democratic senator said, let's get rid of the legislative filibuster, or at least change it. Every single Republican, even while the Republicans were completely in charge of the Senate, voted no. That the essence of the Senate is the right to extended debate, the right to talk our heads off, America's finest hour, and then we'll vote when we think we're ready to stop debate. It used to be 67, now it's 60. For a long time, there wasn't any limit on it. It just went on forever. President Wilson got mad about it a century ago, and so the Senate said, okay, we'll debate until 67 of us think we should stop. And then we changed that, and now it's 60. Some of the most eloquent defenses of the legislative filibuster came from the late Senator Byrd. I remember hearing him at his last speech he made in the Rules Committee, where he said that the legislative filibuster is the necessary fence against the excesses of the popular will, the excesses of the executive. It was the necessary fence, he said, and we should keep it. This fractured nation needs a consensus-building institution, and requiring 60 votes to pass major legislation is the discipline that forces us to come together. I saw the senator from Washington, Senator Murray, on the floor a little earlier. We worked on the legislation to fix No Child Left Behind. That wasn't easy to do. Everybody's got an opinion about kindergarten through the 12th grade. We all know we're all experts on education. Yet we worked and we worked and we worked, and finally we probably got 85 votes for that. And you know what? We made some big changes, but people accepted it. It's a lasting solution, and teachers in 100,000 public schools don't have to worry about us zigging and zagging and changing federal education policy for the next several years, because we talked about it until we came to a conclusion about it and accepted it. An example of the other way to do it is Obamacare. 8 years ago, Democrats had a majority, so all the Democrats voted for it, all the Republicans voted against it, and what's happened? We've been trying to repeal it ever since it passed. It's just a constant state of agitation and a stalemate of debate. Now, Madam President, the tradition has been different for nominations, and sometimes people get confused about that. Legislative filibuster is one thing, nominations are another thing. Until recently, they have always been decided by a majority vote. Now, they could have been decided by 60 votes, but they weren't. at least ever since the a century ago. I'm not interested at this time in assigning blame to the Democrats or the Republicans for what's happened about nominations. But the fact is, even though a senator could have required 60 votes, there never has been a cabinet member who was required to be confirmed by more than 51 votes. There never has been a federal district judge who had to get 60 votes to be confirmed. And there never had to be a Supreme Court justice, with the exception of Justice Fortas. I see the majority leader. I'd be glad to suspend if he has.
I expect my good friend from Tennessee is going to make this point in a moment, but if ever there were a stressful moment for the tradition that even though it was possible to filibuster the executive calendar, it was not done, would my friend agree that would have to be the Clarence Thomas nomination for the Supreme Court?
Madam President, I would agree. I would agree on that. I would agree on that. And we could get into a lively dispute among us about who shot John and who scratched whose back and whose fault it all is, whether the Democrats in 2003, who began for the first time to require 60 votes for circuit judges, or the Republicans who stopped a couple of President Obama's judges, are at fault. The fact of the matter is, I know for a fact that most of us believe that we should keep the legislative filibuster. Now, how do I know that? Because Senator Collins, who is presiding at the moment, and Senator Coons, who will speak following my remarks, offered into the record, April 7, 2017, a letter from 29 Republicans and 32 Democrats, which said, "We're mindful of the unique role the Senate plays in the legislative process. We're steadfastly committed to ensuring this great American institution continues to serve as the world's greatest deliberative body. Therefore, we are asking you to join us in opposing any effort to curtail the existing rights and prerogatives of senators to engage in full, robust, and extended debate as we consider legislation before this body in the future." Madam President, that's 61 senators on record about the legislative filibuster. So one reason the legislative filibuster is going to stay is because there are not the votes to change it. But as I come to a conclusion, let me offer a better reason not to change it, and a reason why we should change it if we consider it in the right way. We have rules in this body. In order to change a standing rule of the Senate, it takes at least 60 votes to get cloture. It has been proposed, and both sides have before used what we call the nuclear option, which is a parliamentary maneuver that allowed the Senate to change a rule without getting 60 votes. Well, Madam President, this is a country that prizes the rule of law. I've heard President Trump say that. I've heard President Obama say that. I've heard most of us say that. And I would ask, if we don't follow our own rules, why would we expect the American people to follow the rules that we write? We are the main rule-writing organization in the United States of America. We ought to follow our own rules. When we didn't and used the so-called nuclear option in 2013, a Democratic senator who's greatly respected, Senator Levin, said that when a Senate that does not, in which a majority can always change the rules, is a Senate without any rules. A Senate in which the majority can always change the rules without following the rules is like a football game where the home team can say, if you gain 9 yards, that's a first down. Or if you make a three-point shot and they need 4, they count it for 4. That's not the rule of law. So, Madam President, I make these remarks, and I hope the senator from Delaware is still here, and willing to say, I make these remarks just to remind the country and to remind the members of the Senate that 61 of us have already signed a letter saying the legislative filibuster, the right to extended debate, the opportunity to talk your head off in defense of what you want, the ability of this body to function as a bulwark against the tyranny of the majority, and in this fractured country as an institution that can produce a consensus that is lasting and accepted by most people, is the most valuable part of this body. And we ought not to trifle with it, whether we're in the majority or whether we're in the minority, and we ought to make that clear. And if we ever do decide we want to talk about it and change it, we should follow the rule. We have rules. It takes at least 60 votes to change a standing rule. I want to put a stop to this talk about breaking the rules to change the rules of the Senate. I will not vote to turn the Senate into a rule-breaking institution. And I hope if that opportunity ever arises, that my colleagues will vote the same way as 61 of them did in the letter that Senator Collins and Senator Coons had signed earlier. Madam President, I yield the floor.